My name is Danielle. I'm the CEO of Women Talk Design, and I'm very glad to have you all here today. I'd love to hear in the chat if you've been to a Women Talk Design speaker stories before, or if this is your first event. It'd be great to hear that. While everyone's typing that, I also want to note that we do have live automated captioning for the event. It's imperfect because it is automated, but it is helpful if you could use some captioning. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat. You can also find it if you go to the top of the page to live. You'll be able to see a link for it there. Just 1 second. All right, I will drop it there in just a second. I'm having some difficulties on my end, but you'll see the live just on top. And again, really excited to have y'all here. I wanted to tell you a bit about our Speaker Stories event, and then we'll get started talking to Val, who I know you're all here to see. So a brief bit, if this is your first experience with Women Talk Design, our larger mission is to help get a more diverse group of speakers on stage. And we're really focused on elevating the voices of women and non-binary folks in design and tech. And so we do a lot of different, now all online events and trainings. And this event came to be based on feedback from folks in our community, wanting to hear from different speakers and their stories and their experiences of how they got started, how they prepare, how they come up with their talk topics. And we also wanted a way to continue to connect all of you and folks in our community. And so the format of this is a couple different parts. We'll start off with our speaker. I'm going to introduce Val in just a second, and I have some pre-prepared questions to get us started. And then about halfway through, I'm going to turn it over to you. So we really want to make sure that you can get your questions answered for Val. And so I'll ask you to put any questions that you have on the chat, and then I'll invite you to unmute yourself and ask the question when I call on you, just so you can have a conversation with Val. It doesn't all need to go through me. And then we'll save 15 minutes at the end, and if you can stick around, we'll put you into breakout rooms. And this is an opportunity for you to be able to meet other people who are here. I have a couple prompts of things that you can ask each other to keep the conversation going about what you learned, where you are on your speaker journey, and then we'll all come back and say goodbye. I do hope that you can stick around for the breakout section. We've heard a lot of really great things about folks being able to connect then. So hope you can stay there. All right, so without further ado, let me just drop in our live really quick. So if you did not see this link, that's our link to our captions. You can follow along there. And I want to introduce you to Val Head. Val is a senior design advocate at Adobe, and she's also an author, a speaker, and a web animation expert. She's the author of Designing Interface Animation from Rosenfeld Media. And she teaches CSS animation on lynda.com and curates the weekly UI animation newsletter. Val has been published by Fast Company, A List Apart, Smashing Magazine, and she's spoken at a dozen events all over the world, including Pixel Up, Web Directions, and UX Week and Event Apart. I'm really excited to talk to Val. We got connected a little while ago to get her involved with Women Talk Design. And I remember, saying like, I've heard you speak all over, and I know that, you have such great experience. And she had a really great story to tell me about her first speaking experience and how things maybe didn't go as smoothly. So that's something we'll definitely ask her about. But first, please help me welcome Val. Very excited to have her here.
Aww. Thanks for having me. I got the gallery view going, and it's awesome to see everyone. And like, people are here from like my favorite cities ever. I'm like, oh man, I wish I could go to Stockholm again sometime. Anyways.
Well, we are so glad to have everyone here. So glad to have you here, Val. This is one of the nice things about being remote, is that we can bring you together and all of us together all over. I want to get started by hearing about what is it that you're currently talking about. I know that there has probably been different topics over your speaking career that you've focused on, and what are you most interested in speaking about right now and why?
Yeah, so most of the stuff I've been talking about lately, or I guess the last little while, is all around like web animation, animation for UX, getting designers into motion, that kind of stuff, like how to design motion. And sometimes it feels like super like narrow and specialized, and other times I'm like, I could talk about this forever and ever. And kind of I guess my main reason, like when you put in the part thing of like, why is it important to you? I'm like, oh my God, why is it important to me? And I sort of have this like not so secret mission of, I guess, the last few years or my career of just like, I want to have designers or help designers feel empowered to use animation and feel like like that they can do it and feel confident about it, and make it just be one of the design tools you reach for, just like type or, hierarchy or all of those things. So that's kind of, I guess my main reason is like, I'm super excited about it. And I kind of hope I can get other people to be as well. So that's kind of the main thing I've been talking about lately. I do some other topics here and there, but that's sort of like the thing I keep coming back to.
Great. So if you are a designer not yet using animation, make sure that you listen to Val's talks and read her articles, because she has a lot to share there. Let's talk a little bit about this first speaking experience that we were talking about. This is something I hear a lot from folks, whether or not they're already speaking or thinking about speaking, is how do I get started? How do you get that first speaking engagement, and what is it like? And so I'd love if you could share a bit about your experience of what was your first speaking engagement, how did you get it, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of like two first ones. Like the very first time I ever talked in front of a group of people was part of a monthly user group I had been attending. And basically, I sort of like the person organizing it was like, hey, we have these like tutorial content and we just need someone to present it next month. And I kind of felt really guilty that I've been going to this user group like every month and learning so much from them. And I felt like I'd never given anything back. So I'm like, I guess I should do it. So that was kind of like the very first time. But then the first time I did like a conference talk that was like my content and everything, they had like a call for talks, and I put in a talk proposal, and I was like, oh, I hope this works. And it did. And it was an interesting first conference experience. It was one of those conferences where they sort of have like multiple tiers of speakers. I like to think this doesn't, like, those types of events aren't around as much anymore, but maybe they are and I just pretend they don't exist. And it was kind of weird because I was definitely like the second tier speaker. I was not like in that group of second tier speakers. And it was really weird that there was also like rock star speakers, and like you weren't the same. That was a little weird. But the talk itself and experience itself was pretty good. It was just like, that was very eye-opening. It's like, oh, that's weird. Okay.
Is this the same experience that you signed up to do a shorter talk and then you didn't know if you were doing a longer talk until you got there and had all this extra time to fill? Is that the same one, or am I confusing those?
Not the exact same one, but they happen fairly close together. Yeah, I was saving that. I was like, I've got, we can talk about stuff that goes wrong too.
Well, let's talk about more things that go right first, and then we'll talk about that and how you were able to keep going after that, because I think that's a big deal. People
Definitely.
are really afraid of all the things that can go wrong on stage, and the fact that you can kind of get over that is a big deal. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you find speaking engagements now? I know that you talked about applying for a conference and speaking at a user group. How do you generally find speaking engagements? And if people come to you, how do you decide what to say yes to or not?
Yeah. So most times these days, I get invited, which is super awesome. Like, it wasn't always that way, but now I'm just like, oh, this is cool. And also somehow it's become part of my job, which some days I'm like, what? How did I do this? So sometimes also it'll be through work where they're like, hey, we're looking for a person to talk about this thing at this place. Or like these days, on this Zoom channel. What are Zooms? Anyways, sometimes it's through work stuff as well, which is pretty cool. When it's something that like people are approaching me and it's not like a work thing, some of the stuff I look for is, like, I guess just sort of like confidence in the fit for the event itself, if that makes sense. Like, kind of looking at if the theme of the event and like the audience they seem to be aiming for makes sense for the talk that they're asking me to do. I don't know, there's sometimes people are like, here, come talk at this conference. And you're like, why, wait, I'm not sure you know what I talk about. Maybe this isn't a good fit. So you sort of have to do that yourself. I look for like a code of conduct rather, and some evidence that they take it seriously, just because it's pretty easy to copy and paste a code of conduct and be like, done. And that's not really done. I usually ask people about like if they have a commitment to speaker diversity, or like what their commitment to speaker diversity is. And then thanks to one of my very smart friends, or two of my very smart friends, Ethan Marcotte and Karen McGrain, they suggested a while back of asking how speakers are compensated. And I find that to be an extremely revealing question. Not necessarily that like every conference always has to pay people like $1 million to speak or anything, but like the way people answer that, I find tells you a lot about like just what, I guess, what you're in for, or what sort of like the tone of the event, and that kind of thing. So I stole that question from them, and it is my favorite question because it's just, I feel like really gives you a sense of what the conference is going to be like and who's running it. So that's my favorite one.
That's great. Awesome. And how do you prepare for your presentations? I imagine now you're giving maybe a lot of the talks that you've given before to different audiences, and so that might be different than crafting a new talk, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how you prepare.
Yeah, when it's new stuff, it's usually pretty messy. Actually, I can put a link in the chat. I wrote about it or I guess it was a long time ago. I thought it was recently, but it's dated like 2018. So basically 100 years ago, I wrote this article about my talk writing process, and it hasn't really changed. It's generally like super messy until it's not. It's just kind of this giant like Google Doc of just like thoughts and random threads, and it slowly becomes something that's more organized. And once it gets to that point is when it's more organized. That's like, sometimes I'll try to make things a bit more modular. So it's like, okay, this chunk could be a talk on its own, or like you can put these two together if the audience is more design focused, and these two together if they're more technical. So I try to make it so that you can kind of mix up the order and the length. And usually I write my intro and my conclusion. I used to only write the intro out word for word, and then I realized I get to the end of the talk and have no idea how to end it. So I usually write that out and write out the end and try to force myself to memorize how it starts and how it ends. And then, just practice until the middle sounds good most of the time, or hopefully all the time.
That's great. What got you started in doing that practice of crafting out the beginning and the end? And why don't you craft your full talk, or like write scripted, I guess?
I'm really bad at like doing scripted stuff. Some people can do it and they can write out like this beautiful essay and they edit it all down and they can like get on stage and say those exact words. I'm jealous of those people because I can't do it. Like I would just sound like a robot reading an essay. But there's definitely people that process works wonderfully for. It's just really hard for me to like stick to a script. I think I get too stressed out in sticking to it that then you almost like, you kind of make it harder for yourself to do it. You're like, oh no, I have to memorize all this stuff. And that's just not a thing I can do. But I find that if I can get started like in a very succinct way and just like set myself up well, then I can just kind of take it from there and go. And it's not totally doing it on the fly. It's like usually, or actually all the time, unless it is just an improvised thing, I've rehearsed it before. So it's kind of like, instead of writing it out, I just do it a million times, and hopefully my brain will pick like the right parts or the right way to explain stuff out of those like 400 times, or it's not usually that many of that like number of times I've rehearsed it. So that's sort of my version of writing it out, of just doing it over and over and trying to remember the parts that went the best. I originally got the idea from kind of for writing that intro and kind of like having a really structured outline when I worked with a speaking coach for a little bit. And he was really into this idea of like, crafting this story and having all this structure. And I didn't really take his exact thing. Like, I feel like you get that kind of advice, you sort of mold it to like your content and the way you do things. But it was a really great structure to start from and just be like, okay, this can keep me focused. So I don't end up just like babbling for half an hour. I actually know what my point is, which now that I say it out loud, it's like, what, you needed someone to tell you that? But yeah, I did. It takes practice to get to that point, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm curious too, with your speaking coach, is that someone you've had since the beginning, or how did you come to work with a speaking coach?
No, it's just someone I worked with. Like, I think I did maybe like 6 or 12 sessions or something. It was some sort of like, package thing, like, hey, I'll help you speak better. That was not his tagline is much better than that. But it was something where I had noticed a lot of like other speakers just were really good speakers, I guess. And it was sort of like, oh man, how do they get to be that good? And then I found out that there was such thing as speaking coaches, and a lot of these speakers that I thought were really good at speaking had worked with speaking coaches. So I was like, all right, maybe I should try that. I don't think it's something you have to do, but definitely if it sounds something that's like something interesting to you, I think it's worth worth working with one. Some people totally are not into that, which is fine. But I found it was really helpful to just even kind of, see that kind of insight to someone else's process and help me better figure out mine and see like what worked for me and what didn't. I feel like your personality plays a lot into the way you can be compelling on stage, or I guess on screen now. And, if you were, there's, I don't know, you have to let your personality show through in some way, I think, to really connect with people. And I think working with a coach and getting that practice can be really useful. If that's kind of, if that's a thing you're I guess working with coaches isn't for everyone, I guess is what I mean. But they're pretty useful if you're into coaches.
Great. Yeah, I think that's great advice, saying, it's for some people, it's not for everyone. And if it is for you, it could be really helpful. That's great.
There's plenty of great speakers who have never worked with a coach, so it's not required.
Well, it sounds like he was helpful too. So that's great.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of these times where things went wrong when you were presenting, and what happened and how did you deal with it? Maybe in the moment, and even like, how did you muster up the courage to then like keep going when like this catastrophe could happen again?
Yeah. So I have two disasters I thought I would share with all of you. Like, full disclosure, they're not my only disasters. I think like if you do enough talks, like stuff is just going to go wrong. It happens and it's totally fine. You just go with it and it'll work out. The one so I'll start with the one that you mentioned earlier, where it was actually, I can't remember if it was one of my early first-ish talks. And I thought that I was getting a 60 minutes or maybe 45-minute slot, like a normal kind of sounding slot. I'm like, cool, 45 minutes, I can do that. And that's just what I assumed, because it seemed like that's what every talk on the schedule was 45 minutes. And so I was, getting my stuff ready, all that kind of stuff. And about a week before the conference, or no, it wasn't even that long. It was just a few days before. I think it's like, as I was like getting ready to go to the place where it was, I looked on the schedule to double check like what, time I was on. And I saw that I actually had a 90-minute slot, not a 45-minute slot. Somehow there was like 3 talks that had 90 minutes and I ended up with one of those. So I emailed my contact at the conference and I was like, is this right? I thought I had 60 minutes. And they're like, oh, well, so-and-so should have emailed you and asked you if you wanted a 90-minute slot. And I was like, no one asked me that. And they're like, oh, well then, and they were basically, got into this really weird thing because they were insisting that I wouldn't have been in there unless I had agreed to do it. But I was like, no one asked me. And it just like, that just made everything super weird. So basically like the day before, I tried to figure out how I could have like double the content I had and make it stretch out. And it was super stressful. And by like right before I started, started the talk, a friend of mine was also at the conference and she was just like, look, whatever it's going to be, it's going to be. No one is going to be mad if you finish early and there's time for questions, it's going to be fine. And it did end up fine, at least for like the people in the room, because no one knew about that exchange of like me not knowing I had 90 minutes. But the kind of situation with the conference organizer wasn't so great because, of course, the fact that I had a 90-minute slot and didn't really totally fill it meant that I got like less good reviews from people. And it just kind of got like, that part was messy. But, the talk itself, I'm like, well, that wasn't like, I guess what kind of came down to is in the end, I really super stressed out about it for a while. But then I was like, well, I didn't ask for the 90-minute slot. No one told me I had it until the day before. I did the best I could. And then I was just a little bit more careful of making sure I double checked how long the talk was supposed to be and that I didn't get stuck in like a double the time slot, which, that was an interesting one. But I have a second disaster to share if you want.
Share it, right? It's so good to hear these things of like, oh, this can happen and you can still be speaking at all these great places. So yes, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. I realized after you had mentioned this question, I was like, oh, I could fill a day with disasters and I'm still here, so it's okay. Speaking disasters anyways. But probably the one that was the hardest in the moment, because like that one, by the time I got on stage, was like, it's going to be what it's going to be. I will just deal. But probably the one that was the hardest in the moment, or the one that like it's like the one that where I was like living a speaking nightmare, where it was my very first Event Apart talk, which if you're into web stuff or UX stuff, Event Apart is like a big conference that happens there. And I finally was like, oh my God, I get to speak at Event Apart. This is amazing. And I got up on stage, they did my intro and everything. Everything was going fine. I was super, super nervous because holy crap, what am I even doing here? And then when I started talking, the screen went completely blank. None of my slides, nothing. It was just like complete blackness. And I was like, so I just started my talk because I didn't know what else to do. Like, what do you do when that happens? And thankfully, so I just started my talk and it did start with a story, which was very helpful. So I'm like, okay, I'll just tell this story because I don't know what else to do. Like, they've already introduced me. I can't like leave. That would be weird. And thankfully, as I was telling the story, which I was trying to make as long as possible, I noticed there was like a couple of the staff people were kind of running around in the back. I'm like, okay, someone is trying to fix this. That's awesome. Hopefully they can fix it. And apparently, so I got through the story, and then just about the time I was done the story, my slide suddenly came on because they fixed everything and everyone applauded because they totally knew I was like freaking out. And apparently that was like less than 5 minutes that there was no slides, but it was like the longest, however many minutes that was of my life. And yeah, that was very scary, but got through the rest of the talk. It definitely wasn't my best talk ever because I was so just like shaken from that, but like I got through it. And you know, anyone from the audience was like, oh my God, I can't believe you still did that. And I was like, I didn't know what else to do. So that was probably the worst technical disaster of just like, you know, it's like the nightmare thing where you're like, oh, I got up on stage and there was nothing on screen. Crap. So yeah, I survived that one. The Event Apart even invited me back. I've been there since. So it all worked out in the end, even though in those few minutes it was terrible.
It sounds like you handled it really well. And I'm curious, did it change anything about how you prepare or what you do, like how you start your presentations or anything like that, to just be aware that it could happen again in the future? Tech fails, it happens.
I think that one was sort of like, I sort of felt like, well, that's probably the worst. I mean, it's a dangerous thing to say when it comes to technology, but I was like, that's probably the worst that could happen, right? Like for like 5 minutes right at the beginning or 3 minutes or whatever it was, like probably that won't happen again. And I also tried to make sure I always had like some kind of related story to the talk to tell. So I'm like, all right, if this ever happens again, I'll make sure I have a story. Or, you know, honestly, for most of the time, even if, you know, you can just keep going. Like I know some other people were like speaking at a conference and the power went out, and it's like, you just keep going. If you know your stuff, you can just keep talking. So that's, I guess, sort of like my plan B in all of this. Like, well, if all the slides stop working, like I'll just act it out. Which I actually have had to do at times, but anyways.
You just get better at improv the more you do it.
Yeah. Seriously.
Well, everyone here in the audience, I want to make sure. Oh, sorry, Val, what was that?
I'm like, some people do say taking improv classes is helpful for speaking too, and I bet that is exactly why.
Totally. I want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask your questions. So I know there are at least one or two already in the chat. I'll ask you to unmute and ask that in just a second. But I encourage the rest of you to add your questions as we go in here. One thing that I promised I would ask, so I'll start with this, is can you talk a little bit about your setup now? I know we're all admiring your video and how clear it is. And it sounds like you have done some online talks or are going to be continuing to do more. And so what is the setup that you have for that?
Yeah, I just got a brand new camera actually on advice from a coworker of mine. So it's the Sony ZV-1 or VZ-1, ZV-1 probably. Actually, it's probably ZV-1, but whatever. We can talk about Zeds later. And it's actually pretty nice. It's like a little camera. It's technically for vloggers and influencers, but my main reason for kind of asking around for a new camera was that I realized like most of the all the cameras I had were essentially like DSLRs, because most of the stuff I do is just like photography. And I realized as I'm needing to do more video because of the state of the world. I should maybe get a camera that does video first, not like as a just add-on thing. So it's been working out pretty well. Before that I was just kind of using whatever cameras I had, which thankfully I had a decent collection of. But it's kind of nice to like have a video camera that shows you when it's doing video. I never thought that would be a thing I needed, but it's important now.
Looks great. Looks great.
Thanks.
Jesse, I know you had a question about compensation. Do you want to unmute and ask it to Val?
Oh yeah, I thought it was interesting to hear that you can tell a lot about the characteristic of a conference based on how they answer about compensation. I was wondering if you could give deeper on that examples.
Well, I guess some of the things that, there's some people that are or some conferences that have been super offended that you would even ask that. And it's like, ooh, ugh, giant red flag. Sometimes people be like, oh, it's a community event, so we don't have money to pay speakers and whatever else, but like, they're super cool about explaining it. And you're like, yeah, that's fine. That's cool. And then most of the time, or maybe not most of the time, but other times it might be like, hey, we're going to, cover travel for everyone. And, like when that was a thing in the before times, or, we're going to pay everyone this amount, or, pay all our speakers or cover all of their travel or whatever. And I think it can just really speak to what's important to the conference organizers. Because sometimes you end up in the case where they're like, oh, well, we just, speakers, they get exposure or whatever. And which is totally fine if like, there's not like there's one answer that's better than the other, except maybe anyone that's like super angry that you asked. But I think it's good to know when you're going into it, like what the expectations are. And there's definitely like super businessy giant conferences that like don't pay their speakers and expect you to pay your way to get there. And their whole thing is like, well, you get exposure for being on our lineup. And maybe that exposure is worth it to you, but maybe it's not. And I think it's better to know that up front before you've totally committed, instead of like, a few weeks down the line or a few months down the line where you're like, oh no, this isn't what I thought it was. So I think it's a really good one for kind of getting a sense of what the conference values and, kind of what their main focus is.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Kathy, do you want to ask your question? Thanks for putting that in.
Sure. So I'm sort of new to giving talks, and I've given a few live talks and a few virtual talks. And I'm wondering how you find that experience. For me, it's nice to be able to read the room in person, although I tend to get out of breath and turn bright red pretty easily in person. So virtual is kind of good for that nervousness, but it's hard to read the room sometimes, and I feel like I'm just talking into my screen of slides. And how do you balance that? Any tips or?
Yeah, it is really different. Like, yeah, I mean, you kind of hit it right there. It's right. It's like when you're doing the live talk, sort of like maybe the best thing and the worst thing about live talks is the audience is right there. Like you said, it can make you super nervous. I totally relate to getting super nervous and turning bright red, because that happens to me a lot. And you get that feedback. Like if you say a thing, you can tell if people understood it or not, because they will either look like they understood or look like they don't understand. And that kind of connection and feedback, and just sort of like this sort of like, we're all here together talking about this thing, I think that thing it gets totally lost for virtual talks. I haven't really found a way to replace it. I find that, a lot of times, depending on the virtual talk setup, some of them make it impossible for you to know that anyone's there. Like some of them let you see people's video or let you see the chat, and then you can kind of get a sense of like, oh, there are other humans on the other side of, my camera, my internet, whatever. But some of the setups just kind of leave you, it's just you in a room, and you sort of just have to kind of, I don't know, like kind of be in that like suspension of disbelief, or I don't think that's quite the right saying, but you just sort of have to like believe that people are there. The feedback part for me really is the hardest part, especially, when you're in those situations where you just don't have any evidence of the audience. And I think it's just kind of like, you just sort of have to fake it and go with it. And what I've been trying to do is, because I've noticed that at the end of virtual talks, it would often be really weird, because you just you know, everyone signs off Zoom and then you're still in your office and talking to your wall, like you said. And that's just like really, I don't know, I felt that part was like almost really depressing because you're just like, yay, I shared all this stuff and that was great. And now what? So I've started to kind of do a thing I did for live talks where I would have like some sort of, usually dessert, because I really like dessert, of like some kind of like treat at the end. I'm like, all right, after this talk, I'm gonna go downstairs and have ice cream. And somehow that makes it less weird because I'm like, well, when I did talks like in person, I'd be like, all right, I'm gonna go find myself like a really good pastry or, you know, whatever. So kind of trying to just have that thing at the end that still reward yourself for doing a thing. You know, it's like, yeah, you're still in your office, but you did a talk, you did a thing, you shared it with people. It's not the same as like just checking your email or, you know,
Yeah.
hanging out on
You can't go
Slack.
have a beer together somewhere
Right.
afterwards or something. Yeah. That's helpful. I think adding something into your routine helps, and just trying to build the endurance to keep it real, even though you're not
Mhm.
getting that feedback without going over the top, like phony, keeping it
Yeah,
real. It's a challenge. Yeah, those are good
it
tips. Thanks,
is.
Val.
I'm glad. I'm glad.
I love that idea of celebrating. And Justine
Yeah.
and Kathy, thank you so much for your questions. We do have some more time for questions. So please, we really want to make sure that we're asking the questions that you want to hear. So you can put those in the chat. And while y'all are thinking of them, I have plenty of questions for Val. So I'll ask her another one. I'm curious, you talked about this post-talk routine now. And I'd love to hear if you have a pre-talk routine. And this maybe could be different if you are at a conference versus doing something virtually, but do you do anything specific in those bit of moments before you actually go live?
I do. It's sort of actually, you know, I just totally didn't even think of it until you asked. I'm like, yeah. So right before talks, I usually try to go somewhere quiet, which like depending on the venue could be easy or hard, and just kind of just like hang out for a minute, just like by myself. There's usually like a good dark corner you can just kind of go stand in and be like, all right, we're here. You know, make sure you breathe, just kind of get myself in the mindset of being like, all right, this is, we're going to do this. This is, you know, I have every kind of that like a little pep talk of like, okay, I know what I'm going to talk about. Everything is done. It's all like kind of just sort of like this letting it go. Like, all right, I can't change my slides anymore. I can't change what I'm going to say anymore. You know, we're just going to get up and have fun and go with it. And just kind of having that like centering moment is really helpful for me, like not just a few minutes before. I guess it's sort of like a transition point, like just thinking about that last question, like kind of like just being like going from hanging out at the conference to being like, okay, now I'm going to go to the giving the talk part, like prepare self, get in the right headspace.
Great, thank you. We can all think about like, how do we get in the headspace? How do we get out of it? I like that, having that boxed off time to both prepare and celebrate afterwards. Thanks, Val. Jenny has a question about your focus on what you talk about. So Jenny, do you want to unmute and ask that to Val?
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of trying to figure out myself what I want to focus on with speaking. There's a lot of things I'm interested in. There's things I've done in the past as a design manager. Now that I'm a consultant, I'm thinking it's probably not as relevant, so maybe I should switch my focus. So I thought maybe it'll be helpful to hear about how you did your focus. So, you know, you talk a lot about animation in design. Was that really intentional at deciding this is going to be my focus now, or did that just kind of morph across a period of time? Or
I was a little of both. Like it was definitely a conscious choice, but it wasn't like a sudden one. It was like from now on I will only talk about this. Like I definitely did some talks on other things, and I still do here and there, but it kind of it was actually kind of happened while I was doing some consulting as well. I spent a good number of years just being freelance and consulting, and I realized that like if there's, you know, the kind of like that whole advice of like put the work you want to do in your portfolio. I'm like, if I talk about this thing that I'd like to do more of, maybe I'll get to do more of it. So it's kind of more of that of like, hey, wait, what if I'm not trying to be like everything to everyone and just tried like focusing on this thing that I find really interesting and I'm really excited about sharing, and hope other people could be excited about too. So it was really kind of more of that realization. That it's like, this is something I really like and I want to share more of. And maybe if I share more of it, I'll get more chances to share more of it. And it sort of worked out. So that was good.
It's great advice. Put it out into the universe and have it come back to you. All right, y'all, this is your last chance to add in questions. If you have them, please do. You've had some great ones so far. I'm gonna ask you, Val, I would love to hear what advice you have for new speakers. And this can be advice that you just learned along the way, because I know you've learned a lot, or maybe advice that you received from someone else on public speaking.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think probably the best advice I would have for new speakers is, pick a topic that you're interested in. Well, kind of two things about the topic. One, it should definitely be something you're interested in, because like to write a talk, even if it's only like a 20-minute or 30-minute talk, you're gonna have to spend a lot of time with that topic. So if you don't like it to begin with, that's gonna suck. And the second is that you don't have to be an expert already. Like I think that interest and curiousness is enough. If you're like, hey, this is a thing I know like a somewhat amount about. I'm not a super expert in it, but there's this thing like I would like to share or talk about or investigate. Like you don't have to be an expert before you do the talk. You learn a lot putting talks together. And I know I have definitely done talks or like proposed talks where I didn't actually know everything I said I was going to cover yet. I just was like partway there. And I know other speakers have too. There's other speakers I've talked to who've totally admitted to like writing up a talk abstract and being like, well, I don't know all of that yet, but I'll learn it by the time the talk is done. So I think that leap of faith is totally a thing that a lot of people feel like you have to be an expert first. You totally don't have to. I think that interest and curiosity can be enough to like put together a good and compelling talk. One thing that I think is probably more relevant now than maybe it was a few years ago, because a lot of conferences are going more the like CFP route and asking for, like everyone submit and, to fill our 6 slots or 12 slots or whatever it is. Just if you submit a talk to an RFP and it doesn't get selected, that doesn't mean it was a bad talk idea. There are so many reasons, especially when it's in that situation of like, we got hundreds of submissions and we only have 10 speaking slots. Like at that point, if it's that drastic, but even in ones where it's not that drastic, like there's plenty of reasons beyond the actual content of your talk that might have been why they couldn't accept it. It could be anything from just like, they didn't have budget left for any more international speakers, or, they already had 3 talks that were really similar or whatever, or probably it would only take one, depending on how focused the conference is. So definitely if you're submitting talks, submit the same one to multiple places, tailor it to the event. Of course, you don't want to just copy and paste exactly, because people can tell and could get weird, if they're not really the same type of event. But, you don't want to, if you just submit it once and it gets rejected, like submit it again, because that doesn't necessarily mean, that's not a statement on the quality of your talk idea. It could be for so many other reasons.
That's really great advice. I love that, especially because that can be something that really holds folks back, is like, what should I speak about? And I know that comes up over and over again with speakers that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious.
We do some great workshops around it, so.
Awesome. Yeah, we do offer workshops on it. I'm going to keep asking questions until we do breakouts, because we haven't gotten any other in yet. I'm curious, you mentioned that you now do a lot of talking for your job as well. So you do both talking outside of work and then talking for your job. And I know that you said you're not really sure how you landed in it, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got into a role where speaking was a part of your job, and how those speaking engagements are maybe different than your speaking engagements that you do on your own.
I think that the biggest way is really just from already doing it. I was already doing talks at conferences, and that was when before this job, I was a consultant for a number of years, and that was just sort of a big part of like how, I guess I did consulting or did all of that. So I think that a big part of why I managed to land a job that it's part of is because it was like a thing I was already showing I could do and was doing. It's just sort of like one of those things where I never would have thought, like I know so many people that do speaking and, their job really considers it to be like this weird side thing they're doing, and like maybe doesn't really encourage it. So I feel super lucky to be in a job where like they really actually do encourage it and support me in these efforts, because it's not fun when, your work doesn't support you in these things that you're doing that are totally, good for you and your career and them as your employer. So I feel very lucky to be in a job where like that's super supported. As far as how like the work speaking things, it's really, Some of it is the same, some of it's not. You know, I feel like all of us for our jobs, like, especially if you're doing design stuff or management, like we all end up presenting stuff in your jobs. And I think the biggest difference is probably the audience, right? Like if you're doing something internally for your coworkers, that's a very different vibe, or maybe not a very different vibe, but at least a slightly different vibe than doing it for like the community or the industry at large at a bigger or an event of, you know, like an industry event that's not all just your coworkers. So I feel like the audience is the biggest difference there. And I'm like, is it better? Is it worse? I don't know. I feel like there's a different set of reasons to be nervous in front of your coworkers versus in front of, you know, your community of peers. So I can't gauge which one is more nerve-wracking or worse.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, thank you all so much. It was so wonderful to hear all of your experience and advice, and I really appreciate you being part of this call and sharing that. And thank you all of you for asking your questions and being part of it. I also want to say a shout out to Adobe XD. They are sponsoring the series, and so if you signed up with a free ticket, or if you're using the captioning, that's all thanks to them. So huge thanks to Adobe XD. I do hope that most of you will stick around. We are going to invite you to join breakout rooms so you can meet other people that are here. Val will hang out in the main room for a couple minutes. So if you do have any questions you wanted to ask one-on-one, she'll hang out for a couple minutes before hopping off. But for everyone else, if you stick around, I will invite you to go into a breakout room. Basically what you'll do there, it'll pop up and say, do you want to go to this breakout room? You'll head on over there. It'll look like Zoom is shutting down, but it's really just sending you to this breakout room. And you'll be there with a couple of people. I recommend that you share a little bit about yourself. You could say who you are, why you joined in today, and also where you are in your speaker journey. Have you been speaking? Are you thinking about speaking? And then was there something today that Val shared that really resonated? I find that that can be a good talking point to start off with. I'm going to bring you all back when there's about a couple minutes left, just so we can wrap up all together. But again, I want to say thank you so much to Val.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm going to open up our rooms, and like I said, hope that you can hang out and join them.